Is Japan doing enough to tackle human trafficking? A U.S. State Department report says Tokyo is failing to address the issue. Are the claims fair? I'm Jafar Hasnan, and today's newsmaker is Japan. Japan has one of the lowest crime rates in the world, but when it comes to human trafficking, Tokyo may not be tackling the problem as it should be. Last month, the U.S. released its annual anti-human trafficking report and showed just how vast the problem is.
21 countries were upgraded a tier because those governments made significant increasing efforts to combat trafficking at home as well as for their citizens abroad. 18 countries were downgraded a tier, indicating that they either didn't make significant increasing efforts to combat trafficking, or worse, that their governments have a state-sponsored policy or pattern of trafficking.
One of those nations on the receiving end of criticism was Japan. While it was not downgraded, it was placed in Tier 2 for the third consecutive year. That means, according to the U.S. State Department, it has not done enough to stop human trafficking. The report did acknowledge Tokyo has made some effort to improve the situation, but nowhere near enough. It said Japan showed a continued lack of political will to address all forms of trafficking, and identify and protect trafficking victims contributed to the government's overall lack of progress. It also went on to say reports of forced labor among labor migrants working in Japan under the technical intern training program persisted in much higher numbers than that which the government identified during the reporting period, and claimed Tokyo did not take any measures to hold recruiters and employers accountable for labor trafficking crimes under this system. Japan's foreign ministry hit back. During a press conference, it was asked what it made of the report. It said the judgment was not fair.
The report you pointed out was drafted independently by the U.S. Department of State according to the standards of U.S. domestic law. Therefore, I believe that I'm not in a position to comment on specific contents. The government of Japan has repeatedly provided explanations to the U.S. side our efforts to combat human trafficking. Therefore, taking those circumstances into account, it is regrettable that Japan's efforts have not been properly evaluated in the report. Human trafficking is a serious human rights violation. Japan's policy is to continue to actively work on human trafficking countermeasures together with the international community.
Well, let's cross over to Tallinn in Estonia now, where we are joined by Adam Whittington. He's the founder and volunteer CEO of Project Rescue Children, which works to end child trafficking. He also led the investigation into the kidnapping and murder of the British girl Lucy Blackman in Tokyo. Thanks very much, Adam, for joining us here on TRT World. Now, like I said, you were the lead investigator in the internationally covered kidnapping and murder of Lucy Blackman in Tokyo. Tell us a bit more about that case. What were your key findings?
Yeah, thank you for having me on. Well, that was quite a large case back in 2000 it was, and it actually still is one of the biggest kidnapping cases in Japanese history. So it was, a fairly complex case without going into too many details. It was a very difficult case. I think one of the biggest problems we had was dealing with the Japanese authorities to actually try and take the case serious. It was initially just a Western woman disappeared, another one, and it was really, really tough for the family and us investigating it to get the Japanese authorities to, get onto the case. And it wasn't until a couple of months after, when international attention started gaining traction on the case, that the Japanese police started to actually investigate.
What surprised you the most from that investigation?
The lack of response, the lack of investigation from the initial kidnapping when Lucy went missing. It just was not taken serious. Hence, we got involved. And I was basically communicating with the Scotland Yard detectives on what we can do out there on the ground. But at the stage, there was no Japanese authorities were taking Lucy's case serious, and that was the biggest hurdle.
Okay, now, Adam, I want to broaden the discussion and talk about Japan's role here in containing human trafficking. Now, since you have been covering these events for a while, tell me, what is your navigation through Japan's Japan's role?
Japan's an extremely difficult country to try and adhere to international laws. You only have to take the lack of will to enforce the Hague Convention that they are a signature to. So working there on the ground, understanding how the system works, and dealing with authorities, I think they just don't take international laws too serious, to be honest, and especially when it is a foreigner involved in a case that could human trafficking, forced labour. As an example, Lucy's case, it was just a foreigner, and I do not see them taking cases with foreigners involving human trafficking, forced labor in particular, as a serious problem.
And there are no local laws in place?
There are, but they just don't. They're very slow to act. They seem to want to act when they want to act, and unless there is attention drawn to a specific case or topic like human trafficking, they're very slow in doing anything like this.
Okay, Adam, tell me, what more can Japan do at this point?
Well, I think they need to take human trafficking as it is, and it is a global, devastating crime that affects thousands and thousands, if not millions, of survivors and victims around the world. And I think they need to really focus and take human trafficking, in particular, their biggest problem, which is labor, forced labor of foreigners, as a serious crime. And until they do, I do not see them being pushed or moved to take it serious.
Okay, now before I let you go, Adam, I mean, human trafficking is an issue which is not exclusive to a country like Japan, right? It happens almost everywhere in the world. So, in the broader context, what do you think policymakers need to do in order to ensure that human trafficking finally comes to an end?
Yeah, absolutely. It is a global pandemic. You want to talk about pandemics? Human trafficking is a $1 billion industry. Criminals are making a lot of money on survivors. And I think one of the first things lawmakers and governments need to do is tighten and make it much more harsher, the penalties for convicted traffickers. At the moment, uh, we even see drug gangs moving towards human trafficking because the sentencing of a human trafficker, if convicted, is extremely light, and the statistics show that a lot of human traffickers, even when caught, will get off in compared to a drug dealer. So you have drug gangs, especially within Europe, moving towards human trafficking, and you can see that exactly crossing from Africa, North Africa to Europe. It's all money. Um,
All right, Adam, thank you very much for talking to us here on the Newsmakers.
thank you.
Let's broaden out the discussion now with three new guests. Joining me now from Tokyo is Mariko Yamaoka. She is the director of Not for Sale Japan and also a member of this teaching committee of the Japan Network Against Trafficking in Persons. Terry Fitzpatrick is in Washington, D.C. He is the director of the Alliance to End Slavery and Trafficking. And Nancy Snow is joining us out of New York today. She's a professor of public diplomacy at Kyoto University. Thanks very much all for joining us here today on the Newsmakers. You know what? I was just speaking to Adam, who was the lead investigators in one of the biggest human trafficking case in Tokyo. And he just told me, Mariko, that part of the reason why human trafficking is still thriving in Japan is because Japan does not take international laws seriously. Is that the case?
Well, I might say that well, they are saying that they're taking it seriously, but from my point of view, it's not effective and it's not enough.
So, what more Japan needs to do at this point?
Well, there are many things that they have to do, and let's see. Well, they now have to hear what the NGOs and the international society is telling them, and well, they need to change their definition of their own definition of human trafficking, and because it's very narrow comparing to the international standard, and they also need to eliminate the trafficking cases, and then another thing is that they need to make the punishment stronger for the perpetrators.
Okay, Terry, let me come to you. So Terry, let me come to you now. So as I understand from Mariko just said, there are more than 2 to 3 problems with Japan when it comes to human trafficking. The punishment is not too strong, and there's certainly a lot more that Japan needs to do at this point. One of them is the definition of human trafficking is very narrow in the country. Tell me, what is your navigation through this?
Well, I think it's important to see where Japan has ranked in the international rankings in the State Department's annual Trafficking in Persons report. They rank almost every country in the world on a tier system, tier 1 being the best. Most of the G7 is there. Japan used to be there, but fell to tier 2 a couple of years back and has been there again in the report that was just released a few weeks ago. The tier 2 countries, which is most of the world, only 30 countries in the world are actually on tier 1, indicating that they're actually doing what's necessary to fight by preventing the problem, prosecuting the perpetrators, and supporting and protecting the victims. Tier 2 is where most of the world is, and that indicates the countries are trying but are falling short. And one of the things that the TIP report called out with regards to Japan, and this is true in other countries, including the United States and throughout the Middle East, is a guest worker visa program where foreign labor recruiters recruit people to come to Japan under a so-called internship program to work in seafood, in factories, in shipbuilding. They're charged exorbitant fees, and once they get there, their documents are taken away, and they find themselves unable to leave and deep in debt. And this is a kind of a guest worker problem and a foreign labor recruiter problem that is really a problem in Japan as well as other countries throughout the world.
Indeed, great points there. Now, indeed, many of human trafficking cases in Japan are linked to this program that you just mentioned, technical intern training program. Dr. Snow, let me come to you. Why can't Japan get rid of this program? What would it take for Japan to get rid of this program when there's evidence out there that so many cases of human trafficking are linked to this very program?
Well, Japan has a labor shortage, so it's not really about getting rid of the program, it's about improving it. The way you improve it is from the sender countries. You've got the Philippines, which is quite strict as far as curbing the exploitative practices of sponsors, of people with whom the technical assistance trainees go into indebtitude. So on the other case with Japan, 80% of these trainees are coming from 2 countries, Cambodia and Vietnam. In those cases, those countries are not restricting the amount of money that these young laborers, many of them who are from poor families who go to Japan and want to send money back home, they have to pay exorbitant fees to these brokers. And that's where Japan could work closer and put pressure on Cambodia and Vietnam and turn this around. The trainee program isn't going to go away. There are also agencies involved. JICA is one. the Japan International Cooperation Agency that is establishing, at least as of April next year, it will go into an initial launch, a way by which these workers can go online and try to seek out information about salaries, about benefits, really bringing more of a transparency to this problem. The thing about human trafficking is that this is not the around the dinner type conversation. The human traffickers don't self-identify and the victims don't self-identify. There's a lot of shame. A lot of them end up dropping out of the system because they arrive in debt, thousands of dollars in debt, at least half of these trainees, and they go further into debt. So that's what leads to this servitude. It's a problem, but I think the country of Japan can turn it around, especially as it faces hosting duties next year in Hiroshima, where all of the G7 leaders will come together.
Dr. Snow, very interesting points here. Let me ask you one more question here. Is it possible that all of this is happening with almost no knowledge of the Japanese government?
Well, the Japanese government plays an integral part here. And the report, the reason why Japan, which was tier 1 in 2018, has had some slippage is because the State Department says there is this lack of a political will. I think there are plenty of good people inside the government. I used to work for the federal government in Washington, but they're facing a system where there are a lot of moving parts. You have to have political will from elected officials. You have to have the courts actually impose much stricter penalties. It was already mentioned that a lot of these traffickers are getting off too easy. You have to have more of a public campaign, a public concern about this issue. The Japanese people are well known as supporting international justice, the UN system, sustainable development goals, and the UN human rights. So to get the Japanese people on board, you can use public opinion to bring pressure onto the system and to help move it further along.
Right, and I mean, Japan has also one of the lowest crime rates in the world, so it's mind-boggling to see a crime like human trafficking is still thriving within the country. I just want to pick up on what Dr. Snow mentioned. The U.S. report also says, as Dr. Snow highlighted, that in Japan there is a continued lack of political will to address all forms of trafficking and identify and protect trafficking victims. Why is that?
I think if you frame the issue as not just a crime, and not just as a crime against an individual, but as a fundamental violation of human rights, of women's rights, of child rights, of migrant rights, and labor rights, that helps you understand how you may want to increase your efforts to solve this problem. And also, I think if you look at this as an economic problem and not just as a criminal problem, that can generate some political will. And the way to do that is to think about who are the victims of this problem of human trafficking and forced labor. It isn't just the people. It could be your export economy. Your economy could be embargoed in Japan or elsewhere in the world, much like China's has just been from the Zhanjiang prison factories where Uyghur production is going on. The United States has banned products coming in from those regions because they're so heavily tainted with forced labor. And the EU is doing similar kinds of import restrictions if products are tainted by forced labor. So if a country starts to recognize that its economy is at stake, that can generate some political will. And so corporations need to be held accountable or even liable for what goes on in their supply chains. And workers need to be given the right to sue if there are violations and not just rely on the government or law enforcement to protect them.
Terry, fascinating points here. I just want to add one more question for you here. Are you indicating that it's more of an economic problem than a crime?
It is both. I'm just saying to think about it as both. Don't forget that there are individuals who need assistance, who need support systems when they come out, who need repatriation if that's what they want, or need to be able to stay if that's what they want. And there's all sorts of trauma and psychological problems that people suffer in these situations. So it's not just to think about the individuals, but also the economy. So it's broadening the lens, not just one or the other.
All right. Now, Dr. Snow, let me come to you. Certainly, human trafficking is not exclusive to Japan. It happens almost everywhere in the world. And this is something that was highlighted by Carrie Johnstone, acting director of the U.S. State Department's Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons. She said several East Asian countries had been downgraded to the lowest tier in the U.S.'s latest report. So tell me, what can policymakers do at this point to contain this problem?
One way you can change it is like what was just said, making it a broader issue. For instance, in Japan, these foreign workers come in and they are often deemed separately. They're there temporarily and then they're going to leave after several years. And so it becomes a foreign problem. But it's not a foreign problem. As it was said earlier, this is an us problem. This is about protecting human dignity. This is about allowing someone to have a livable wage and not to live in secret or get off the grid because they're so indebted that they can no longer participate in this technical trainee system, for instance. You don't want to have a situation like that where somebody becomes an illegal, because then the system is going to come down hard on that person. So the more we individualize it and say it's just a foreign problem, that's part of the problem. You make it an us problem, you make it a global civil society problem, then you can have that progressive change. And it's like I said earlier, when the G7 get on the stage together and they're all sort of shaking hands, I'd like to see them united next year in Hiroshima, all at a tier 1 level, Italy and Japan included, in that very symbolic city of Hiroshima that was once seen as a victim of a nuclear cloud, but is now seen as a place of peace and redemption. You can do the same with this human trafficking combating as well.
So are you optimistic that something significant could come out of the G7 meeting in Hiroshima? I mean, the G7 has met in the past as well. We did not see anything significant come out of those meetings when it comes to human trafficking. So why do you think something would come out this time?
Well, I personally am optimistic because there is much more of a proactive effort on the part of the Kishida administration to emphasize democratic values and human rights. And I know there are cynics amongst us, but the fact that we're getting data now from the Japan Immigration Services Agency, which actually surveyed several thousand interns, and were able to reveal, and it was picked up in the press in Japan, that over half of those arriving are already in debt. This was new information for me. I had no idea how bad that was for so many of these new arrivals. It was so startling that I wanted to talk about this, even though this is not an expert knowledge base for me, but it is about human rights protections. And that's where we all can be more interested and pay attention. And when you have data, that's when you get institutions and people to move, including politicians.
Okay, great points there, Dr. Snow. Terry, let me come to you. This is going to be my last question of the program. I understand the U.S. has taken a lead role in identifying where human trafficking is thriving, in which countries it's thriving. But do you think there is a greater role that countries like the United States can play at this point to contain this problem?
Yes, no country is doing enough, even the ones that are on tier 1. And the G7 did make a communique when they met in the UK a couple of years back, but it needs to go farther, and it needs to work as a unified bloc to put some real teeth into that. And international coordinated work would be the way to get this done instead of going country by country by country. Let me just conclude by saying, think about how impossible it might have seemed 150 years ago when small groups of abolitionists were trying to outlaw the slave trade. But they succeeded. And this was at a time when slavery then was baked into the global economy and was considered morally acceptable. But they won that fight. They didn't end it, but they outlawed it. And now many of us in the anti-trafficking and anti-forced labor and anti-modern slavery world feel we're trying to just finish the job, to bring that promise of freedom to people who are forced or trapped in these situations. And just like our predecessors succeeded in what must have seemed an impossible challenge, and just as now we see there are 25 million or more people trapped in these modern forms of enslavement around the world, we'll be successful too. I'm optimistic that the public just won't put up with this. And when governments act together and put their money where their mouth is, we will win.
All right, unfortunately, we are out of time. Mariko Yamaoka, Terry Fitzpatrick, Dr. Nancy Snow, thanks very much all for joining us today here on The Newsmakers. And thank you for watching. You can follow us on Twitter @_Newsmakers and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Jafar Hasnan. See you next time.